Welcome everyone to the strip grazing fall forage cover crops webinar. I'm Erin Labrie. I'm the beef systems extension educator for the southwest part of the state. And this project was made possible by a partnership grant through Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, or SARE. And my colleagues that were involved, a big part of this project include Jack Arterburn. He'd be the educator up in the Northern Panhandle. TL Meyer is our educator in the Central Sandhills. Ben Beckman is up in the northeast part of the state. Brad Schick helped with our South Central site. And then our beef specialist, Mary Drewnoski, helped with a site over in the eastern part of the state. And so the purpose of this project was really to address this question of whether strip grazing is worth the additional time and labor for the increased harvest efficiency when grazing cover crops in the fall. And we had 5 producer sites across the state that compared a continuous to a strip grazing system of similar fall forage mixes. And then this project was repeated over 2 years. And so tonight we're going to hear from one of the producers that was involved with this project, Brock Terrell. Brock collaborated with Jack, again, up in the Northern Panhandle. And so Brock's going to share a little bit about his experience and observations, strip grazing fall forage cover crops. And then we'll have Mary Drewnoski share some of the data across the sites and observations from the Mead location with growing calves. Well, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put those in the chat, or you can also unmute and ask your question. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Jack for the producer perspective portion.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So Brock and Heidi Terrell, they're part of Terrell Farm south of Hay Springs and down on Mirage Flats. And so I worked with them. They've been real big supporters and helping me out in different projects and different tours and things like that. They're really outside the box thinkers and not afraid to try something unconventional or unpopular, and so it's been a pleasure getting to know them and working with them, and so I appreciate that. I guess Heidi, would you give a little bit of background, I guess, on your operation and kind of a quick summary of all the things you guys are doing right now?
Sure. Brock was going to join. I think he's still supposed to join. I am not quite sure where he is at.
I made it. I'm here.
Yay. Okay. Brock, go ahead and give the overview, please.
Okay, well, I guess we're a cow-calf farm and feedlot operation in northwest Nebraska. We're 3rd generation on this operation. My grandfather moved here in 48 and started farming here. So all our farm grounds irrigated, and then we lease and own grass where we summer the cow herd on.
Perfect. And you guys have kind of been dabbling in cover crops for a number of years now. I guess can you give a little bit of background on your experience with cover crops and how you first became interested and started using them, and I guess how long you've been using them, and kind of that sort of background?
All right, so we kind of started dabbling into the irrigated winter wheat, and probably in the late 90s when we're kind of starting to look at irrigation water restrictions and such. And when we had that extra growing season, and we started just planting turnips in behind winter wheat for a grazing crop. And so we've been at it for probably close to 30 years now, and getting more, I guess, variety, more species growing on our cover crops, and with the amount of hailstorms and such, we've we've tried a lot of different things, different seasons, and keep doing it because we feel like we're gaining on it, I guess.
When you say you feel like you're gaining on it, is that from a soil health perspective? Is that just from a feed perspective and being a good resource, or can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, kind of all of the above. So it's a great feed resource, and our limiting factor, and
You still there, Brock?
the crop, like say grow winter wheat, and then we've got all of August and September that land could be productive, and instead of it sitting there idle, we're basically getting another crop in 4 years, or by winter wheats followed by dry edible beans, and then followed by cover crops. So we're getting 3 crops in those 2 years.
Excellent. And with your guys's the kind of the trial and error of cover crops, when did you, I guess, what did the grazing strategy look like initially? And did you end up transitioning to more of a management intensive strip grazing? Was there a time when you ever used it in like a continuous system where they had access to the entire field?
Yes, that's the way we started. And as we learned more, we pushed the limit and pushed productivity of it, and realized that utilization was one of our weak spots. So that's when we started strip grazing.
Yep. And as part of the project, I think we wrote it in the grants. We were gonna, I think we wrote it in there for 2 species, and you guys ended up choosing irrigated oats and turnips. And you mentioned you started with turnips initially, your first introduction to cover crops. Any thoughts on why you went for oats and turnips, that combination?
So I like some grass species in there to get, for a lot of reasons, but the more variety we can throw at that mix, the more risk tolerant, I guess, we are, because of the one of them's going to grow and going to produce well, but I like the grass mixed in with turnips or other brassicas, because the cattle just get so loose on the feed quality, so high on those brassicas that I feel like we don't get great utilization because digestion is just so fast. So if we can put some oats in there that'll freeze down and make a little more dry matter, slow down digestion a little bit, we get better utilization.
Yeah. And I remember at one of the years, you had mentioned that you wanted to let the oats freeze down a little bit, just to kind of get a little more dry matter and lose some of that water. And so you might, I don't know, Brock, if you're on the phone or if you're on a computer, but I'm sharing a few pictures here just to give folks a little bit of background. Again, it was irrigated oats and turnips. The first year they had some summer calving pairs out there grazing it, and the second year were some heifer calves. You can see quite a bit of growth there when I was setting out cages. I think this would have been in November timeframe, is about when we started both years. So again, there's just another photo up above the tire there, and so quite a bit of growth. Pretty good forage. Pretty good forage resource. Like Brock said, they had a number of months where nothing was being grown after wheat harvest, and so it's a good. Looks like it's been a good tool, and I just want to throw in a couple pictures because you could only see really the oats in some of these pictures, but and I had a few others from the first year that I probably should have thrown in there too, that had quite a few turnips coming in there. But the turnips are out there, And they definitely cleaned up those leaves, and even bit down when the ground was frozen, they would bite off the tops of the turnips. And so thought that was kind of interesting. And you could see some of the wheat stubble there on the left as well. So there's quite a bit of that, and most of that ended up getting trampled in. Anyway, this next photo is just kind of showing the difference between an area, the green in the background there, and in the foreground here is where they would have been grazed initially and then let into the greener area. And so quite a bit left trampled, but they definitely utilized a lot. I think there's just another comparison. And then this would be, I think that's just another what was left after it was grazed, and you can see quite a bit of trampled, including the straw that was left. The wheat stubble was all trampled down and pretty well flat. And then this would have been the continuous, where there's quite a bit. You can see different kind of patchy grazing and trampling, and some left. And I guess it's kind of, I needed a better photo to compare the two, but there was definitely a lot more utilized in the strip grazing versus the continuous. There seemed to be quite a bit that was wasted. And so this is in the foreground here would be the continuous grazed, and in the background there would be the strip grazed again. So Brock on the or Brock or Heidi, I guess. Because I know Heidi, you did quite a bit of the fencing, I guess. I think I remember right, you were kind of shooting for weekly moves, and looking back at my records, I think it was about 10 acres each. And so I was just curious, as far as the labor standpoint, I wanted to give folks an idea of, what it took to implement strip grazing. I think, the initial setup of the exterior fence would be the same for the strip or the continuous, and the difference would be the moves. And so I guess talk a little bit about that, weekly moves, and why you chose weekly moves, and how long it would take you to set those up, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so as you stated, the exterior fence is the same either way, and that's a electric wire and rebar posts that we put in, and we put those in around all our fields. Then we use polywire and step-in posts for our interior fences, and it takes probably 20 minutes to set them up. We obviously like to plan ahead, and we'll fence hopefully in such a direction that one roll of polywire will stretch across where we're fencing each time. So we're definitely paying attention. We want to keep them within 20 minutes, move, either tear up or set down. I'll have 2 moves set up, so I have my emergency catch. If my first fence fails in some way, they just jump into the next pen, not everything. So I try and keep the next one always set up, move them, set up the next one after that. In the winter, I'm kind of thinking a weekly move just for sake of ease. It tends to start to freeze, and we get a lot of utilization still within a weekly move.
Perfect. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like the backup fence too. So when something can go wrong, it will go wrong. It says, how many acres and head are we talking about? And so let's see, let me pull that up really fast, so I don't want to shoot from the hip. I can't remember how many pairs we had out there. I've got that. There was 87 head of pairs on 83 acres for 44 days in the strip grazing in the first year. And then we had 7 head of pairs with bulls included in both of these, on 7 head on 8 acres for 38 days. And then in the second year, they went with heifers. Let's see, 65 acres, initially had 138 head, and then added another 100 head on the 65 acres because of how much was being left. And so they ended with about 234 head on 65 acres. And that was for about a month. The continuous, they had about 245 head on 71 acres, and that lasted a little over a month.
Yeah, so just for perspective, if you just look at average stocking densities, it's for the continuous in the first year, it was a little less than what would be a cow an acre. And it was more like 15 cows an acre on stocking density. So in terms of how much you would be moving, something like that for the strip. And then in year two, it was a little over a cow an acre, and then something like 20 cows an acre if you were to put them on cow basis. So it's a stocking rate of about a cow an acre for continuous and 10 to 20 times that for strip grazing.
Thanks, Mary. I think, is that the only one in the chat? Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I should have taken a picture of your fencing rig, Heidi, because I appreciated that, because it doesn't have to be fancy. It was just an SUV with a trailer. And I remember I don't remember I said to Heidi, but she said it's cheaper than a side by side, and it worked good. And I know a lot of planning went into each one of your moves, because you showed me some of the maps you used, and that makes a lot of sense to try and especially make it easier. And so 20-minute moves, I think a lot of planning helps that out. And the other thing I wanted to ask about was how you determined how big to make each paddock. And like I mentioned, you sent me a map, and I should pull that up on the screen while you answer that question. But how did you decide to how big to make each paddock?
Well, somebody who's technical, and you did do some forage sampling and to see how many pounds per acre. At this point, we kind of just eyeball it, and I want the number of head to graze about a week. And on that 1 year, second year, we estimated 10 acres. That was too much. We had better forage there, so I went down to 8 acres per move to stay within that week move. So we just estimate where we're at, and I plan it out on pasture map, as you can see there, and I use it on my phone, and so it's GPSed. So wherever my phone goes, it has a little blue dot, and I can see it. So I actually can build my fence to that map each time, and keep my paddocks pretty much the way that I want them. I saw that there was just a question about water. So like on this map that you see, I've watered down there in that first paddock, which is the biggest paddock where I started at 10 acres before I dropped down to 8. We put our water down there where we start. And then we don't have any back fences when we're cover crop grazing in the fall. If we were wanting to have regrowth, then water would be a different issue, and we'd be doing some back fencing. But in this case, we don't. So the water is always in the first paddock, and we just always are going back to that to drink.
Yep, thanks, Heidi. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the place in the bottom right is where the water was. And as she said, they moved away from there. So we would come in and sample after every move, just so that anything that was utilized or trampled after that wouldn't be accounted for. So you see the strip graze on the right, continuous graze on the left, and then kind of a buffer left in the middle there. So let's take a look. What else were we going to talk about? So so you talked about you kind of eyeball it based on how much you think they're going to eat after a week, and kind of I guess adjust from there. And as far as cover crops, you guys have been doing it a long time. Obviously you're pretty efficient with the strip grazing as well. What would you say are some of the advantages and disadvantages of strip grazing?
Well, the biggest disadvantage will be just having to go out there and do the fencing. And some summers or some falls, we have really great falls, and it's not that bad. The freezes don't come in so hard. The snow doesn't come so soon. we're able to graze these in, 30 to 45 days, in late fall. And so those are some of the disadvantages that I would say, to it, but the advantages, in our opinion, far outweigh it with our, one, the cover crop is covering the soil all winter, which is huge to us with our farming operation, and it increases our soil productivity. And then the utilization, you just cannot beat the utilization that we get out of it. So,
So
Excellent.
animal performance on the year we did the calves was just a tick lower in the strip graze, but the efficiency way more than made up for lack of performance.
like 3 or 5 pounds.
Yeah, it was, yeah, almost, probably statistically wasn't any different.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you could definitely see it. Did you ever notice any difference in cattle behavior? Every time I went out there to sample, I went and drove around and kind of stirred everything up. But when you're out there moving and that sort of thing, did you ever notice any differences in behavior between the two treatments, whether when you're out there moving fence or just driving by?
The strip grazers were more content, especially towards the end. They were still getting onto fresh feed, and maybe the last 10 days, 2 weeks, the continuous grazers were kind of like, maybe we should be getting a little more than what we are. But yeah, other than that, I don't recall anything different.
Yeah. And I've got some photo evidence somewhere of that, of how the continuous graze we're looking to eat, because they tore into two of the exclosures, I remember. And so no, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you guys, Brock and Heidi, being a part of this project. I appreciate you getting on tonight and kind of sharing your experiences with it. Are there any other additional observations, or maybe even you mentioned a few tips and tricks along during our conversation as far as implementing a strip grazing? Anything else to add?
I'd say one of the unforeseen maybe benefits of the cover crops has been weed control. So the following spring, there's a dandelion every once in a while that grows in that, but there's hardly any weed pressure, and sometimes we just go out to spray because the corn's going to get too tall to spray, and so it makes a really nice mellow seed bed to plant in, and all that residue on the surface keeps the weeds at bay, and it really makes farming nice the next spring.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit about that too. As far as tillage and that sort of thing, when you're going into that, do you ever have compaction issues, around the water or throughout? And maybe if you saw any differences between the two treatments by chance?
No, actually, this year's corn crop, I couldn't see anything on the yield monitor as far as any difference between the strip graze and continuous graze. So our farming practices on that is we just strip till and plant. We don't do any other tillage on that. What was the last part of that question?
Oh, I think you pretty much answered it as far as
Okay.
tillage, and if you saw any differences between the two. And so we've kind of been hitting the questions in the chat. So I didn't know if there's any other questions from any participants as far as the project, or Brock or Heidi, if you had anything else to add. Yes, if any of the participants do, you can put it in the chat or unmute.
And we can definitely continue. If you come up with questions as we go, we can always shoot back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Brock and Heidi, are you guys going to be able to stay on for the remainder of the program?
I think so.
Okay, perfect.
Kat just asked, did you guys soil test before the cover crop?
Yes. Yep, we do cover soil test after wheat and then again after the cover crop. And it's usually calls for not a lot, 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen we usually inject on the cover crop.
And then we also had a question about your target planting date. for the
Uh,
cover.
as soon as possible. So as soon as the crop's off, and so we bale our straw for the feed in our feedlot. So it usually takes 10 days to get the straw baled and the bales off. But it's a priority to get that crop planted because one day in August is worth a week in September. So get it in and get water going on it and get it growing.
So Brock, you're typically, would you be getting in kind of early August then?
Yep. Yeah. Usually the 1st to 10th of August is the typical plant date.
Or Heidi, see there's a question in the chat. Do you have any secrets for post put into frozen ground?
Well, obviously, we've tried lots of different ones. There's not a lot of secrets. If it gets down to it and it's super frozen ground, the best you can do is go out and drill a stinking hole and plant it in. But there are the pigtail posts that have a metal stem that you can pound on with a hammer and kind of get pretty aggressive with and get into the ground. And then you can also get it out of the ground by kind of moving it around. The other plastic posts, even if they have a metal stake at the bottom, the O'Briens are one of those. And if they're new, they're a lot better. If they're 10 years old, they're a lot more brittle and they don't take as much. But in the winter, those metal pigtails I've found stand up the most if you need to take a hammer to them.
Yeah, so we ended up using just metal rebar and with an insulator on it so we could pound them in. And boy, getting them out, getting them in wasn't the problem. Getting them out was the problem. So I'm really interested in trying out this year. This is what I'm going to try out is these tumble wheels from Gallagher. So I'm really interested to see. The idea is that it basically whatever's on the ground isn't hot and everything else is, including the line that goes across. So we'll see if that works better for frozen ground, because that was probably the worst part, was trying to get them out of the ground. Although the other day we were on a podcast with Doug Steffen, who was also on this project, and I had asked him about that same question, and he said that they used vice grips to twist their posts, and that made it easier to get out of the ground, which I thought, wow, that's a good idea, because I would always kind of roll them around, and sometimes I'd bend them a little bit.
Yeah, I've got my brother-in-law uses those tumble wheels for grazing smooth brome, just splitting up some pastures. Not in the winter, but he really likes them and they work really well. And he even spaces them out quite a bit more than they recommend and gets along just fine.
I'm going to move on here and talk a little bit more about everybody else's sites and kind of what we saw in general. And just like the Terrells, the majority of people were using oats with a combination of turnips or rapeseed. So he was talking about the purple top turnips and them eating that bottom part of the turnip. Rapeseed doesn't produce that bulb, and purple top turnips are really about maybe a 40 to 60 day maturity. So they start building in more and more energy into this root system. And then as you saw, that whatever's below the ground, when it freezes, the cattle can't really utilize that. So I actually really do like rapeseed because it just continues to put on more leaf until it gets winter killed. So from a grazing standpoint, I can capture a little bit more out of it. And used to be cheaper on a seed pound basis than purple top. It's really now probably about equal. And most of them were planting in this August timeframe, either early to mid-August, and then grazing. Some started in October, most started in November. So similar to what you just heard about waiting a little bit and going in a little bit later. And I do want to point out, over time, we see, just as they mentioned, they really set us up well. The quality is really high on the oats and turnips that are late fall planted. Basically, we got corn silage with alfalfa in a river in terms of the feed value. So it's really great feed value. And it, even though it looks horrible after it freezes down, it maintains its value fairly well. Now we're not quite as high as corn silage, we're still pretty good. So I think it's really important to recognize that looks can be deceiving. And then the other thing just to point out is we can get pretty good gains on calves. So as Terrell's talked about, they grazed some calves on their stuff in the second year, and then they had pairs the first year, which lactating cows is another good use because the quality is so high. And we do see a little bit of boost in performance by adding that brassica in. So oftentimes I'm shooting for about 30% brassica. So at 3 pounds of rapeseed and 50 pounds of oats, that gets me about 30% of the biomass to be the brassica, which I kind of like. So this was actually done out at US Mark over 3 years, and pretty interesting stuff. They also saw something, shack there, something with marbling, where marbling is increased due to that brassica as well, which is pretty cool. Okay, so an overview of the project. There was 8 total comparisons. So we had 5 locations. Some locations only had 1 year. Some locations had 2. 6 of them had that oat brassica mix that we were just talking about. 2 of them had a multi-species mix that was really, the base was a warm season grass. So those were planted a little earlier, like in July. Most had cows being grazed. And 3 of them had growing calves. So the Terrells were one, and then both of the eastern Nebraska sites that I was involved with were growing calves. The majority started grazing in the fall. 1 did start grazing oats and turnips late in March. So that would have been fully winter killed and looking pretty brown by then. Most allocated to strip twice a week. 1 did once a week. And 1 actually went out to once every 3 weeks. So that's kind of the overview of what that looked like. So then what I have here is kind of a summary of all of those sites. So the first thing I kind of wanted to show you, I know I got a lot of numbers, we're going to walk through it, is really just an idea of what the stocking density was. So in this case, it's like thinking about 996 pounds of body weight per acre for the control would basically be, like either 1 cow per 1.5 acres or 2/3 of a cow an acre, if you want to think about it kind of like that. And then on the strip graze, it was really more like 10 cows an acre was kind of what they were allocating over time. So this is how much access they had to forage at one time, if that makes sense. So go from 1 to about 10 on average. Huge range here, right? So went from basically what would be like 1/3 of a cow up to maybe a cow and a third. Or on this one, we had some that stripped and they were pretty generous with how much they gave them. And that would be that one that was every 3 weeks, right? Because they were giving them more and going less, up to some pretty intense grazing at what would be somewhere around 20 cows an acre allocation. Grazing days averaged around 50. On one, they only grazed for 7 days on the control, and then continued grazing only on the strip. Apparently they didn't like the control very well. And wasted a lot of forage, I think. On strips, 26 to 83 days. And the 83 days was one of the sites that I was involved with. And so I want to show you a little bit of information about that one in particular. No real difference in pre-graze biomass across the control and strip. So a great comparison to be able to be made here. About a ton an acre was on average, range from a half a ton to 2 tons. And the 2 tons was that warm season mix, if that makes sense. So a little lower quality, or a lot lower quality, but a lot more biomass. So now we get to the brass tacks, right? What did we see? In terms of the amount of AUM, so basically we think about this as 1,000 cow or 1,000-pound cow for a month. How many of those could we graze on an acre? For the control, we got 1.17, and for the strip, we got 1.66. So on average, of all the producer sites, 55% increase in the grazing capacity by strip grazing. Now that ranged tremendously. It ranged from a low end for one site at one time of 12% and the high end at 118. I looked through that data trying to figure out if there was trends on things like, how often they allocated or what the forage type was, whether or not that, warm season was different, and really I couldn't pick anything up. So it is a bit of a range in response, but on average, 55%, which, boy, that'll pay back fairly quickly. So I think that kind of fits with what I have seen. What really got me interested in this was I was getting maybe 1.3 AUMs per acre in fall grazing with calves, and out at US Mark, they were allocating about once a week on some stuff, and they were getting about the same as this. They were getting, about 1.5, 1.6. And I was like, man, that would make a huge difference in the cost, right? And the value. So I think we're seeing the same thing. I want to talk specifically here just about what we saw in eastern Nebraska, because I want to get back to what Brock was talking about with growing calf performance, because I do think that is something that's important to recognize. And he hit the nail on the head when he said performance was reduced a little bit, but that in terms of the way I think about it is gain per acre, it's still paid. So this particular site was an oat rapeseed mix. We actually had 3 replicates of each treatment. So we had the steers who were continuously grazed, the steers who were allocated forage twice a week. And then they were 15.5 acre paddocks with 14 steers allocated per paddock. And they were 550-pound steers. So growing steers put out at about a calf an acre for the continuous. So this is kind of what it looked like. This was an irrigated field, so it had some corners that were dry land here and here. So we actually made these to be blocks because there was a little less forage here, and we didn't want to bias things by treatment. And then we just randomly allocated the other 4. We did like they did, which is that we started where we had water here, and we would strip and just move forward. No back fencing, because it would have been winter killed and wasn't going to be regrowing. And then we didn't have to worry about, we just hauled water actually to all of these sites. So we didn't worry about doing any kind of back fencing. Okay, so I want to show you some pictures, because pictures worth 1,000 words. And this is what it looked like about the time we turned out. As you can see, the oats were kind of frostbit. The turnips still look pretty green. So that's what they looked like when we took some clippings. This was the rapeseed here, still fairly green. The oats, just the tops of them were kind of frosted off. And then this is what it looked like about 2 weeks later. We'd gotten some snow. This is the strip graze group. This is where they were. And this is what they had been moved into. And you can kind of see it was pretty tall, it's about belly high. Looked fairly brown, but again, that rapeseed kind of held on to the greenness. And every time you'd move them in, they go and pick out the rapeseed. So you can kind of see This was when they got a new allocation, and they were going and finding that rapeseed and selecting it out first. Seems like they really like the rapeseed once it gets frosted. So I think that's kind of interesting that it sweetens up or something, and they really do like it. And again, you can kind of see this was the 1st of January, and they had snow that was probably a foot high, especially in the strips. That was one thing we noticed. The strips caught the snow in the area they hadn't grazed, whereas in the continuous, it tended to blow off. So there's positives and minuses to that. If you're looking for soil moisture, the strips probably helped us out with soil moisture. With the continuous, which you can kind of see in the background of this particular shot, because that's their fence right here, and that was a continuous, it would disappear more quickly. Pluses and minuses to that. At the later end of this grazing, we started getting some pretty heavy snow accumulation. So this is what it looked like middle of January. You can see it kind of melted down at this point. Doesn't look as tall. It's still there. And this is what the continuous looked like. They were getting to where they were pretty, well, they had selected through what they really liked, and now they were having to get down into stuff they weren't particularly enjoying. And then by, the first week in February, this is what I was talking about with that snow accumulation. These are the 2 pictures of the strips in February. We got a lot of snow. It had accumulated. It was pretty doggone tall, but they still went in there every time we moved and would go to grazing. They were pretty happy, actually. So if we look at the energy content, I just wanted to show you, we sampled kind of over time. This is digestible organic matter, but you can just think about it like TDN. So at the beginning of the season, treatments weren't different, which shouldn't be, but they were somewhere around corn silage in terms of energy. And then if you look at the continuous, it declined over time, which we'd expect, because they were selecting out the good stuff, right? So every time we went out, they had selected a little bit more of the good stuff. The strip, this is actually what was not what they had grazed yet, right? So this is basically just showing you how it had changed over time just due to weathering, right? So still really good stuff by the end. So 70 days in on this one, we're still at 70 TDN. That's better than any hay you can get. It's not quite corn silage, but pretty close in terms of energy. So still really, really good feed. And in fact, the cattle told us it was really, really good feed. So this year was that really, really cold winter. We got all that snow, and the wind chill was, I think on this particular day, by the way, I went out there, which was kind of crazy. It was like -50. We thought we maybe need to give these cattle something. So we put sweet bran out to each of the groups, and the continuous went straight to it and ate it all. The strip, we'd given them a new strip, and they're over there standing in it. They had started grazing, and then they were curious what I was doing, of course, so they'd all turned around, but they were completely happy to be just digging through the snow, eating their oats and rapeseed. Mostly rapeseed is what they were kind of selecting out again. And we had been giving them maybe a little bit more than we had at first, and they were wasting a little bit more because of all the snow, and we were allowing them to be a little bit more selective. But I was just really shocked that they didn't touch this. They were happy as clams. Okay, so I want to talk about their performance. And on this one, we did have good yield that year. It was almost 2 ton. We did water, which made a difference. We got about double the amount of grazing. So if you think about that head days per acre, we almost doubled it, which fits pretty good with that 55% on average that everybody saw. In terms of average daily gain, we did decrease it by about 1/3 of a pound, but this is still a really nice rate of gain, right? 1.7 or so. And then if we look at gain per acre, now you start seeing, this is why Brock said it still probably pays, right? In this case, we increased the gain per acre substantially. So we calculated cost of gain. They said 20 minutes for a move. It was taking us about 30. But the cost of gain was still lower for the strip, even when we accounted for labor. So this is kind of our partial budget cost. Of course, everybody's going to be different in terms of what your labor costs are and all those things. But we had seed in at $11 an acre, seeding at 12, fertilizer. We did put on nitrogen at about 50 pounds. And that's at 15 plus the application. We put that on through the pivot. We did irrigate, so we had to pay for irrigating. And then we also, because this was actually after a failed oat crop. And we did have weeds. So we went ahead before we planted the cover crop and applied a herbicide. So that's not always necessary. In this case, we did. So we charged for it. And then we charged $5 an acre just for putting up that fence or perimeter fence. But our labor cost $26 an acre. So even with this extra cost, it still looked pretty doggone good on a cost of gain basis to go ahead and strip. So with that, I will answer any questions, and I'm sure Brock and Heidi would be happy to do that as well. And I want to make sure to thank Sarah for providing funding. So the other question was, is there any soil tests that were collected in it? And no, there was not soil tests for most of these sites for this particular project. That's actually the next thing that we have proposed to do, is actually to follow up with continuing to work on strip grazing, but now look at impacts on the soil. Also want to monitor where the cattle spend their time. So doing some GPS stuff, looking at where they kind of spend their time. There's been some observations that on the continuous graze, sometimes that they spend more time in the areas that are maybe a little less productive. And so if the strip graze is actually creating maybe more uniformity, that might be a benefit. So we're kind of interested in that. And then the other part, of course, is the labor part. So like we're talking about the difficulty with putting that fence in. So we're kind of intrigued about using the tumble wheel, or actually have a colleague, we're going to try virtual fencing and see how that works. So we'll let you know how that all goes. Oh, I have another question on here. What did you have for a perimeter fence? So on our fields, we just had a single strand of electric fence. Just had to make sure it's hot. And that's actually what we used. The first year is actually used electric fence wire for the strips. And then we got smart and actually got some poly wire, which made life a lot easier. Any other questions? Were you starting calves in a lot first before turning them out? Yes, that's actually why we waited until November 15th. We would buy calves in. We would start them in the feedlot and fence train them in the feedlot before turning them out, because we didn't want them, we would be hauling them a distance away from our main facility, and we didn't want them to be getting out. So we basically get them fence trained beforehand. Any mineral supplementation? That's a great question. And the answer is yes. We provide a free choice mineral. In terms of the main things that we really need in there is really copper and zinc. Is probably the biggest ones that we were looking for with this fall grazing oat and turnip mix. So nothing really fancy. Oh yeah, what do you expect a virtual fence to cost? Great question. Right now it's pretty expensive. It's about $100 a collar. So using it just for a short period of time wouldn't pencil out. So you got to have a lot of use for it. But I think, like all technologies, they usually get cheaper over time as they start learning what the needs are, as well as how to make them more cost effective. So I don't think at the moment that if I was just using it for this specific thing, it would pencil out, but we're also going to try them with season-long grazing of annuals and being able to do more rotational grazing and maybe capitalize on more forage that way as well. So it may work. We'll see. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about with virtual fence. Yeah. So if you think about like a dog collar, you know, that they have where they have that, they put a collar on it, it'll shock them if they go across a certain line. And they used to have to bury a line, if you can remember that, and it would basically shock them if they went across that. Now they can basically use GPS to tell the cattle or the dog in that case, like here's the border, and it'll make a sound when they get close to the border. So that little unit will give them an audible sound when they get close to the border there, and then they will learn that as long as they turn around at that point, they won't get shocked. So it's pretty interesting. It seems like cows are fairly effectively, they figure it out. The question is about, especially about lactating pairs, whether or not the calf will pull them some outside of that area to get shocked. But we're learning all about it. Yija Zong, who is right there on that article, which was in our Beef Watch. She's our precision livestock management specialist, and she understands all this stuff much better than I do.
Got a question where the mix is just 2 species. Yes, most of them were like an oat brassica mix. We had a few that had more species, but the majority of them were.
Yeah, so the warm season mixes, one was a 17-way mix. That was the other one that we did at Mead. So it had Japanese millet, pearl millet, and then it had winter triticale, vetch, turnips, and a whole bunch of other things. Sunflowers. That was actually the most interesting thing on that one. When you would give those calves a new strip, they'd go select the sunflower heads off. The sunflower heads had some mature seeds in them, and they figured out real quick that that was the good stuff. So the continuous graze, of course, went and demolished that right away after they figured out it was good. And then the strip always looked forward to the next strip so they could get more sunflower out of it. There was another mix, which was a forage sorghum, vetch, rye, had a brassica, I can't remember which one. Actually, I think it had turnips and rapeseed. And so it was a fairly diverse mix as well. Didn't really see much difference in terms of the efficacy of grazing, of strip grazing, right? It worked fairly similar in both situations. So question about prussic acid. Are there any worries about prussic acid? So oats and turnips and brassicas, they do not produce prussic acid, and forage sorghum does. So you can't start grazing it until after it is fully killed in the fall, if you're going to be grazing during that frost period. The mix that we used that just had millets in it, millets do not produce prussic acid. So it is something to consider in terms of species selection. If you're wanting to graze earlier in the fall, you probably don't want to use sorghum sedans, or sedan grass. You want to stick with the millets if you're looking for warm seasons.
There was one question before that, Mary. When watering, what tips do you have to not freeze between bringing water to strip?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually had propane heaters that we would we had big tanks, just to be honest, you know, like the 700-gallon tanks that we would fill up because we were hauling water, and we had propane heaters. So nothing magic, but that's what we were using. I don't know if the Terrells had any thoughts on that, about what they do to keep their waters from freezing.
Yes, we were able to use a hydrant where we were at, and we use a valve that will leak the water. We have a float, but then a leak valve on the side that would keep our water open. So we were able to not have to haul water.
Awesome. So did you so you didn't have it freeze over in the tank?
No, we were able to circulate water at all times. It was on a float system, but we had a little valve that would run continuously.
Awesome. Okay, Heidi, you asked, was there any differences between the grazing in March and November? I mean, in terms of the efficiency difference, there wasn't really a whole lot. And I don't know, because site to site varied so much in the amount of initial forage, like I can't talk about would they have gotten more grazing out of it if they had started earlier. I can just say that the difference between the two treatments was similar. That's all I got out of that one. I don't know, Aaron, that was one of your locations. So any observations?
No, it didn't really appear that there were any differences.
So that would be one of the things that maybe caught my eye a little bit, and where we do think out of the box, that kind of grabbed me even more to be like, hey, you don't need to graze your crop as soon as you can get to your crop. In our system where we want to be able to turn yearlings out to grass as early as possible and get out of our feedlot, that now tells me that maybe if you were to hold a crop until March and that's your plan, maybe, is that what they were doing there?
No, there was an issue, a health issue, and so the producer wasn't able to get the cattle out in the fall like he originally had intended. But I will say we didn't really have weather issues that year. And so I would be curious if we had more snow and winter weather, if it would be the same.
I will say, just to kind of echo that, one of the things when we were doing continuous grazing in the fall, we saw huge differences in the amount of harvest efficiency, and it depended a lot on the weather. And I would say the same thing would hold true if we got some precipitation. We lose a lot more forage and disappear, if that makes sense. So I think there would be a huge advantage if you're going to do that in the spring to strip grazing, particularly in a wetter year, because you're only going to trample in less forage on those wet periods because they don't have access to the whole field. So my guess is there'd actually be more of an advantage in that situation.
All right, any other questions?
I will say, if you guys are really interested in strip grazing, as I said, we had a podcast where we had another producer talk about how he uses cover crops and strip grazing on his operation. It's one of the most recent ones. You can go to the Beef Watch podcast, and it was really fun to listen to his thoughts. We spent an hour, and I looked down and was like, wow, it's already gone an hour. So it was pretty great.
Well, thank you guys for joining.